We no longer need all this delicate, refined machinery of the criticism of ideology. This would be the first one. The second statement would have been the practical inefficiency of psychoanalytic treatment, like it doesn't work. The third one would have been what you already pointed out, this problem of illegitimate use. Like the idea being the main categories of psychoanalysis are developed in order to be applied to individual psyche. What right, like isn't Freud, almost in the Kantian sense, involved in the illegitimate use of psychoanalytic reason when he speaks about, for example, revisionist collective obsessional neurosis or whatever? We don't have the right to make this step. So that I don't take, as usually I do, too much time, can I just briefly reply, very briefly, to these three? The first one, I think that here, all of three of us, I hope, if I'm not right, so much worse for you, but I think that we share the same, that this is a way too simplified version, that this notion of direct, cynical transparency has its severe limitations, how should I put it, that there is still, precisely beneath the subjectivity which is hegemonic today, it's kind of a superficially hedonist, whatever subjectivity, there are very complex mechanisms, maybe not of classical repression, but of disavowal and so on, which still, perhaps even more than ever, call for Freudian apparatus. If anything, I'm tempted to say, even only today, Freud really comes at his own. That is to say, it's clear that if you look closely at Freud, his true problem is not, to be very vulgar and to ironically refer to Oedipal, I would like to have good sex, but the internalized paternal authority is blocking it, so how to do it? No, the problem is not I would like to, but I cannot enjoy, because the problem is that you are allowed, solicited even hedonistically, and you sabotage yourself. It's a much deeper sabotage which we confront in a much clearer way today. So I claim that more than ever, what Freud truly discovered, we confront the deadlock he was struggling in, trying to resolve it in all these hypotheses, then death drive and so on. The deadlock, which for me is precisely one way to approach it, is the way Judith refers to Hegel. Here I sincerely feel solidary with her, because my dogma, if, as you put it in American gangster movies, like at a gunpoint, tell me where do you stand. My idea is Hegel and Freud, like read Hegelian negativity, subjectivity as something that can throw a new light on and also okay, the first point. Second point, more important, theory clinic. Here Adorno did some good things, namely when he pointed out how already Freud was aware that the relationship between theory and clinic in psychoanalysis, it's not simply one between theory and practice in the sense of the task of theory is to explain, ground theoretically the possibility of practice. For me, the key statement by Freud is when he says a society in which psychoanalysis would be fully possible would no longer need psychoanalysis. That is to say, there is an authentic dialectical tension in the sense of, to be slightly cynical even, psychoanalytic theory always is at the same time theory of why praxis should fail ultimately, of why you cannot solve. You know, there is a dialectical tension. It's not simply theory grounds practice. The crucial point, this big reproach group, illegitimate use of psychoanalytic reason. Yeah. There, even more, I think, Freud should be defended. In what way? The usual defense, I claim, is too cheap one, which simply says, no, but look closely at Freud. Isn't it that precisely the individual subjectivity is constituted through Oedipal or other intersubjective relations, so intersubjectivity is already there? That's not strong enough. What I claim is that Freud asks another question, which is a crucial one. The point is the following one, to simplify it somehow. It's not simply that, that we have a gap between, let's call it, the objective social level and the individual experience. It is that for me to be, under quotation marks, normal, that is to say, functioning within a symbolic universe subject, this gap between my experience and some anonymous social field, Lacan would have called it big other, like this should be inscribed into my very experience. I should be able to say, I should be able to integrate this minimum of, how should I put it, reification. In the sense of, for example, as I use it in my class, you know, the gap between the majority does this and between when somebody does something tasteless. It's a different thing to say, oh, most of the people don't do this, and to say, in a much stronger normative sense, one doesn't do it. This minimal reification, of course, I would agree immediately with critics who claim it shouldn't be accepted as a fact. Yes, and that's my point. Freud, here is, I think, the true legitimacy of Freud. The question he asks and answered, I agree with you, in a way which is historically limited to Oedipus, is precisely how do I come to, how should I put it, to internalize this gap so that I, in my very subjectivity, distinguish between what is my self-experience and what is this anonymous, objective social order, because one of, for example, one of the definitions, very simple one, clinical of psychosis, would have been precisely that this gap collapses so that then this other which limits me is no longer experienced as anonymous order, but as precisely another subject, the paranoiac persecutor and so on. So to avoid in advance our possible misunderstanding, because the enemy who wants to drive a wedge between progressive forces would no, I totally agree with you, and that's my point. I'm not saying precisely that this objectivity is a fact. And that's, I think, the deepest task of psychoanalysis. We can debate if it succeeds or not. That it, even in a kind of a transcendental move, it asks, of course, everything is not just a matter of personal experience. But the big problem is, how do you, as an individual, experience this gap?
Yeah.
I stop.
Okay, that's really helpful. Larry, do you want to go next?
Yeah, I thought I might.
Is there a big choice? Like,
No,
this
no.
is what I call false offer democracy.
No, it's not a false offer.
I would,
Actually,
no, and I would
I
actually,
like
because
to
I
quote-
have a brief bookend
Good,
to add. and
good,
then
good. It would be useful for me, actually.
back and forth, perhaps. I would argue with regard to the current state of psychoanalysis and that crisis that we're facing is, of course, a recurring crisis. It used to be situated within social studies. Today, it seems to be situated, at least academically, within religious studies. I would say that one needs, at least in California, to include psychotherapy itself in all its eclecticism as what I refer to as greater psychoanalysis. It is in psychotherapy, to this day in California at least, that when a patient or client, as we say, comes to the therapist and spouts out religious or political beliefs, the therapist is trained to read them first as potential symptoms. So much for the bottom line of religion.
So this effect that you are describing, it is happening.
Yes.
Pretty horrible, sorry.
So what I'm arguing is that psychoanalysis seems, if you look out into the world or out into California, is at once repressed but also represented. Another thing I wanted to mention with regard to my own, two things with regard to my own relationship to psychoanalysis and politics, would be something that the Frankfurt School said. It's not sure whether Adorno first said it, repeated it, buried it, or whatever, namely that both the culture industry is psychoanalysis in reverse, and that fascism is psychoanalysis in reverse. And within that frame that has always intrigued me, at least beginning with the case of California on through Nazi psychoanalysis, I see the possibility, however impossible that possibility may at the same time be, that I think is congruent with some of the last works on psychoanalysis that Jacques Derrida